Hi, I'm Dino Daizovi.
And I'm Veronica Belmont. Welcome to the Mobile Security Show. We're live here at the Babio Center on the campus of Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey. And in addition to all the students, faculty, and local technology professionals, we've got a great panel of security experts. Today, we are joined by Ed Amoroso, Chief Security Officer at AT&T, Charles Crouchman, Senior VP of Product and Delivery, Information, Robert Griffin, Senior Security Architect at RSA, and Stephen Freed, author of Mobile Device Security. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
I think we'd all like to be able to carry one phone or tablet that works for our business and personal lives, but that may raise security concerns for the IT department and privacy concerns for the individual. Does having workers carry a single device do more harm than good? That brings us to our topic of discussion, securing the enterprise use of personal devices.
So let's start with where we are now. Robert, people like you and me bring our own phones to work every day. Why is this an issue?
Well, for two reasons, really. The first is it exposes private information that we have within the corporate environment, and so might result in information you didn't want exposed to the enterprise, presented to them in ways you didn't intend. And the other is from the point of view of the enterprise, that there may well be things that you bring into their network, for example, that they would prefer not to have, malware or sites that expose them to legal issues, for example. So both those sides are critical.
And who has the main point of where's the onus in that situation? Who really needs to be paying attention to where the security faults may be?
So both sides really do. And in fact, at EMC where I work, RSA is the security division of EMC, we allow employees to bring devices to work, and the onus is on the employee to make the right decisions about what to do. So there's lots of education around that, but there's also the onus on the enterprise to make sure that, for example, understanding what configurations are appropriate is well documented, the tools that the employee needs in order to manage their devices are provided. So it really is on both parties.
I read an interesting article where they were saying that now that people are using their personal devices at work, companies are kind of seeing that as an opportunity to almost outsource their IT to companies like Apple or the Android manufacturers when there's an issue. Is that a terrible idea or a good idea?
So I'm not sure it's really outsourcing IT. It's clear that there are economic reasons why it's beneficial to the enterprise, certainly in terms of the cost of provisioning and so on, but I'm not sure it's as great as it seems at first glance. There's still significant help desk responsibilities, for example, and there are significant issues in terms of training especially. That was mentioned in the last panel. I think it's even more important than was perhaps called out in terms of that cooperation of the enterprise and the employee and the amount of investment that the enterprise has to make in the employee to make the right decisions.
Which brings up a good point, like how much control is the employee going to give to the enterprise to configure their device and implement the enterprise's security policy? And actually, Stephen, let's throw this to you.
Sure. A lot of enterprises are looking at, how do we allow employees to bring their own device? Bring your own devices is sort of a mantra now for a lot of organizations for a lot of economic reasons. But the problem a lot of organizations are seeing is that the policy aspects of that are very difficult. So if the employee attaches to the corporate network, who owns the device? Who has the ability to access the device? If it's lost and the organization wants to wipe the device for getting rid of sensitive information, does that give them permission to also wipe the personal data that's on there? So it's a very murky area. There aren't a lot of common standards around, and organizations are really trying to feel their way through it.
Interesting. What do you think, Ed?
These mobile devices that people are carrying around used to be conveniences, right? Where if I had to, I'd just pull the thing away from you and you'd still be productive. But they've moved from convenience to necessity. So I bet if we asked people in this room, which would you rather have, your PC and no phone for a week or your phone and no PC for a week? I'm going to guess almost everybody would pick the latter.
Oh, maybe we should ask. Who would rather have their phone over their PC for a week? It seems everyone in your class.
I know what their answer is.
Yeah, I know I couldn't go without my phone for longer than a day.
It's very difficult to go without texting, without the ability to communicate. So for that reason, we know that hackers and anybody with a malicious sort of intent or just a curiosity about what works and what doesn't they're going to start attacking with more frequency and more intensity mobile devices. For that reason, when you're in charge of enterprise infrastructure, and I do that for a living, your first goal is the integrity of your infrastructure. So when people come in and they say, well, I'd like to use this or that device to get my corporate email or VPN to different apps to do this or that, the correct answer has to be, well, if you do that, then there are some serious strings attached. And those strings have to be things that the employee agrees to. They can be pretty onerous.
All right, well, here's a possibly, a question that may not be so popular. Why should the enterprise even allow their employees to use their personal devices to VPN into their network or use an unsecure connection?
Well, I think there are two really important reasons. The first is they can't help it. Really, they can't help it. At EMC, for example, as soon as the iPad 1 came out, 8 of our senior executives had it the next day and brought it into work and said, we want to connect these up.
Right?
So, and in fact, it's 38 million iPad 2s are being sold this year. So a huge number, 400 million smartphones worldwide or something in this year. So the pressure on IT is just, I think, unavoidable. But I think there's a positive side as well, which often is forgotten. If that technology is brought into the enterprise actually can benefit from it in terms of innovation, in terms of the ability not just to attract folks who want to use those phones, which is important, but also in terms of the ways in which they actually help individuals and groups of individuals to work better together. The question that you asked about, would you rather have a phone or a PC? Last week I was without my PC for a week and used my BlackBerry for virtually everything, including reading an Information Week article this morning about the number of PCs and number of tablets and iPhones.
Veronica, I think there's an interesting sociological aspect also. I mean, we have now the first generation of people that's grown up without knowing life without the internet. And without and has always had the ability to instantly communicate with a small device. And so as these folks come up and go through school and start entering our workforce, they're expecting these tools are going to be there. And if our companies are going to be able to attract and retain good, talented people, they're going to need to embrace this technology, or else these folks are going to go somewhere else.
And Charles, do you think it's worth the risk?
Yeah, it's not a question of if anymore, it's a question of how much. And I think that's really what corporate IT departments are struggling with right now. How far can I go? How far should I go? What's the difference between a traditional device that I owned and therefore I could do anything I want with, and these new individual bring your own devices that I don't own anymore? Those are the questions they're struggling with. It's not a question of if, it's simply a question of how.
How important do you think it is, Dino, that a company be able to exert some amount of control in terms of the security over someone's personal device?
I think it's actually very important because the personal devices can transport data in and out of the enterprise, can transport software in and out of the enterprise, and so there's a certain responsibility for the enterprise to protect itself from these potentially, malware that may exist on the employee's device and things like that. The alternative is that the enterprise can just treat itself as a mini internet and just make every device as untrusted as just a random node on the internet, but that takes a lot of work.
It's hard for me to kind of reconcile the idea of being a user who has my own personal device and feeling as though the issue at hand is my use case, how I'm using my phone, and if I'm putting my company at a liability. Like, I would almost want to think that my company was making sure that anything I did didn't affect the internal systems or the internal infrastructure. But at the same time, I get worried about that loss of privacy and that loss of that almost invasion in your personal device. So where's the balance? I guess.
It's a difficult question. As you may have heard, RSA was breached back in March, and the first thing that IT did at RSA was to lock down the internet. That is, to really limit what sites we could go to. And as a corporate responsibility, that was absolutely the right thing to do. It clearly imposed limitations on all of us at work, quite difficult ones, about what we could do. At the same time, it meant that they were much safer in terms of possible additional attacks that could have been launched through other mechanisms, drive-by attacks and so on. So that kind of limitation on the part of the corporation was really an essential part of responding to an elevated threat landscape at that particular time in our history.
And what you're talking about here is part of a larger trend that's often referred to as the consumerization of IT, which really at its heart means we're moving from a command and control sort of a situation where IT dictates to the end users what they can and can't do with what, to a place where the consumers are saying to the IT department, this is what I want, you go figure it out. So it's an empowerment of the end user that leads to greater employee morale and productivity. It creates a real consternation for the IT department. This is a trend that's broader than just mobile devices, and it's something that's transformational across all of IT right now.
All right, and no one wants an angry IT department. It's never fun. All right, well, we're going to take a break, but we're just getting started. When we come back, more on using personal devices in the enterprise world. We're back. Now, Steve, you oversee security for a banking enterprise. What type of constraints do companies need to put on the actual users in order to kind of protect themselves and make sure everything's safe?
Well, there's a couple different avenues that the companies are taking. The first is just a pure policy route, where a lot of them are creating formal agreements with their employees who want these devices, saying, if you're going to use this device, especially if it's a personally owned device, you're going to give up certain rights to that device in terms of the organization's ability to populate it, wipe it, secure it, manage it, and do what it needs to do. The other way companies are attacking it is through technology and choosing either secure ecosystems, like the BlackBerry environment that's all kind of constrained, or sandboxing technologies that allow you to segment off a portion of the device and keep that piece secure for your corporate email and your documents and things like that, and your calendar. And then the other part of the device, the unsandboxed device, the user can do whatever they want, and then you're using the technology to constrain what moves back and forth between those areas.
And how do they actually do the constraining?
The constraining is through the technology. In other words, for instance, in the sandboxing environments, they make it extremely difficult to move information from the sandbox environment out, or to take information from outside that environment and put it in, which on the flip side is really annoying to users. I mean, I have a pad that I use that has that kind of technology, and very often when I'm taking notes at meetings, the only way I can get that note to my colleagues is to take that information, send it to Gmail, and send it back to my corporate environment, and then put it out. So the technology to do that constraint is still immature, but it is getting better.
Are the policies kind of evolving as time goes on and technologies change, or is there more of a blanket type of policy for the entire company?
I think that the policies are changing as we get more experience with these devices. So, as you all know, originally the policy was, no, you couldn't do it. Mm-hmm. You'll get the device that we give you and that's it. We've seen that hasn't worked very well, so now it's evolved to, okay, you can use certain types of devices as long as we have the ability to secure them either through policy or through technology. As we get more experience and as the technology gets a lot better, we'll see changing of policy to, okay, you can use whatever device you want as long as it has the capabilities that we need to secure it.
I'd actually add two other areas to the two you mentioned, Stephen. I think in addition to the sandboxing and the policies, there is also a constraint on what assets you can get to without a sandbox. So, for example, that you may be required to use a VPN in order to get to certain applications, for example. And then the other is the restriction on what sites you can get to through whitelisting or blacklisting. That can be either technological or just on policy again. But often it's very common to say that there are certain sites that if you're using your device at work, or even if it's been used at work and you're using it at home, you're then constrained in terms of what sites you can visit.
I agree. What you were saying is absolutely right. That's exactly the kind of protection and control that we want. The one thing I haven't seen, though, is what you're describing as being common yet. Mm-hmm. It will be soon. I think to date, what you see are passwords, remote wipe, and encryption. And let's take remote wipe as an example. You have somebody sign a little agreement that says, hey, if you're going to bring your BlackBerry to work, then to snap it into corporate email, you got to agree to these terms, and here, sign this. And whether they read it or not, I don't know. But somewhere in there it says something like this.
No, they don't read it.
Here's a use case. Let's say, for whatever reason, the company decides that they can muddle along without you and decide to terminate your employment. It's like, so that's the first punch, and then the second punch is, oh, by the way, we're going to zap your phone. Zap! It's like you're fired, and zap! Your phone is now, toast. So it's a little clumsy right now. I mean, that's not the right way to be doing security. We all know that's not right. Having users sign forms they don't read, that's not right. I think what you're describing is exactly where we want to go. But my observation is that in certain elite corporations, I would put RSA in that category, you do see some pretty advanced stuff, but the vast majority of large, medium, and definitely small business, they do nothing. A bunch of devices out there without even 2 seconds of thought about mobile security.
And Ed, you bring up a good point. You know, when a user gets a flashy new device and they just want to get their work email on it, they'll sign anything just to make it happen. Just like users will click through any warning and say, yeah, I want to make this happen, go, 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 go. Right. But in the day they decide to leave, the reminder of what it means of saying, we're going to wipe your device, and if you don't have a backup of all your personal data, you're going to lose it. Yeah. You know, might be kind of
a bit of a wake-up call.
Yeah, because there really is no kind of like selective wiping in that scenario.
A little bit. Is there? There could be. There could be. I mean, fundamentally, the correct way, I think, from a security perspective, to sort of organize your affairs is to keep as much of your data off in some virtual cloud as possible. So then it comes down to credentials. So if somebody wipes your phone, you still know your Facebook login and password, right? So that's easy enough to key back in. And, any calendar information and other types of stuff, if you've just been fired, then it's probably, unfortunately, irrelevant anyway. But so the point is you really can survive these types of things, and the phone can still be functional. But the point is, we would all agree that it's a pretty clumsy process to say, sign this thing, and then, if something happens, we'll, zap your phone. And again, zapping your phone is not easy either. It's not a slam dunk.
And Charles, have you seen any way of making this easier, like making the communication with the users more clear, and what policies you can do to make it less of a shock?
Yeah. So I mean, the first thing to say about that is again, as soon as, and it's different whether you're talking about a consumer use case, whether it's a consumer or an enterprise. But in the enterprise case, the moment that a user brings their device onto the corporate network, they do have to cede some level of control to the corporation to manage that device. And now all you're doing is arguing over what's appropriate control, right? But the fact that that control is ceded is an absolute requirement. Once that's a managed device on the network, now you're just talking about what's an appropriate policy. Today, in this early market, what that definition of control is largely constrained by technology, right? The technology is not available to do all the things we'd like to do in the ways we'd like to do it. You either do a complete wipe or nothing. That was the original use case. Now you can do selective wipe. Over time, it gets better. But what you find over time is that the real constraining factor is how mature is the IT organization who's managing your stuff. Right? Once the technology gets out of the way, then it'll be a matter of how mature is your individual IT organization, and that varies wildly from company to company.
Well, that's actually what we're going to talk about next, the technology. After the break, we've got more on the hardware and software tools that will help to usher in the dual-purpose device era.
First of all, we're seeing a reasonable amount of scanning activity on port 53.
They have now blocked an entire subdomain.
It's possible that someone would be able to remotely install an application on their handset.
iPhone has been pretty good in terms of keeping malware off of it. Android, not so much, and it seems to be picking up speed.
This attack is at layer 8. It's the human layer that you're attacking here.
Right.
Thanks very much, and look forward to talking with you next time.
And we are back. So, Ed, we've covered the business side of the story. Now let's talk technology. What do you think are some of the hardware and software hurdles that we have to get past in order to solve the problems of personal devices in the workplace?
So let's look at somebody like our friend over here, Dino, who is a very good hacker. What we're proposing,
I think you mean elite hacksaw.
Oh, yeah.
That's what's on my business card.
That weird hacker talk. I'm too old for that. But what we propose to do, like with Dual Persona, is that we're proposing to build a little software wall around something that allows me to push a button and say, boom, now I'm in safe mode, and I've got software controls around me so that I can go do business stuff. And then when I'm done with that, I go, boop, and I push a little control, and now I can go surf porn and gamble and do all kinds of crazy stuff, and it won't affect what I was doing in that sandbox. The challenge is that we in the computer science community have been trying to do that sort of thing for a very long time, and as the hacking community will attest, generally they get broken. So whether we can do better this time, I don't know, but generally to date those things have been broken.
I was going to ask you, is there any expectation of privacy for the consumer in that kind of scenario? Like even if you're plugging into a work-safe mode, is it still private? Is it still safe?
I mean, it depends on what's implemented. I mean, is there a guarantee from the technology that my personal traffic is going to be VPN'd in a way that the enterprise can't read and shuttled outside of the enterprise?
Mm-hmm.
Is there going to be like a traffic level separation? And I think it comes down to a lot of things. And if so, how is that enforced? Same thing with like the sandboxing and virtualization. How well is it implemented? Because anything in software theoretically can be broken.
And if I'm, reading, downloading wares and watching porn on my personal device, should I feel as though my data is safe then from the company on which I'm also sharing data with?
I think you can feel that. Depends on if the traffic is isolated, but I think the bigger concern might be actually for the enterprise. If you're in personal mode and you're, going to the sketchier parts of the internet, you might pick up some malware, and then when you flip over to enterprise mode, what guarantee do they have that the malware hasn't broken through the sandbox?
Mm-hmm.
In that regard, in fact, it's related to the dual mode that Ed talked about, but I think the use of virtual desktop actually is very important. At EMC, when we get our iPads, the first thing we're required to do is to download VMware VDI onto the iPad, get credentials to use VDI, so that the only apps we have access to from the iPad are a set of limited corporate apps. That is a completely transient session we have of them. There's no copying back of data back to the corporate environment, and very little likelihood of propagation of malware from the iPad back up into the corporate environment. So for us, VDI is hugely important, and more, I think, than perhaps is often realized.
Charles, what are some of the other software solutions that companies are looking at, and how easy are they for an employee to implement and use?
Right. So what's going to become more important over time as we start to see more malware? Today we've seen very little relative to what we're used to in the PC world. As we see more malware, we're going to see more frequent OS releases, more frequent patching of mobile OSs. And so the ability to be able to continuously, over the air, provision and configure these devices to keep them up to date to current patch levels so that for known malware, you've already got a solution in place, will become more important as time goes by. Encryption, both of data at rest as well as data in flight, is going to become, I think, a standard in the same way that it is for corporate desktops. Anti-malware software that's able to actually keep your device in continuous compliance. And again, in the same way that you're used to on the desktop, will become more important over time.
Is there a way for the enterprise to actually force updates on a device that they have partial control over, the way that they can, log in remotely to someone's desktop in their office?
The short answer is yes, but the long answer is a lot of these capabilities we're talking about, where the capability particularly is part of the OS, not provided by a third-party application, varies widely by device. Each device OS has different sets of capabilities around enterprise, around security, around management in it. So the answer is it depends on the device you're using. Certain devices have that available today, other devices not so much.
You bring up an interesting point. Basically, the time to respond to a threat is actually very important to mitigating it, making sure the threat doesn't spread to other users. Mm-hmm. So how fast are users updating their devices, and how often do they do it?
A lot faster than traditionally you would expect. A lot of these new consumer devices with the consumer-based OSs on them are a very large percentage of them are updated right after the OS is released by the OS vendor, more so than you'd see in anything like a PC client operating system. So very rapid uptake on new OSs is part of that. So the good news is when that happens, everything that was broken in the old one gets fixed. The bad news is new bugs get introduced, And because we don't have this cadence yet of frequent patching of mobile device OSs, what we'll start to see is these windows of time when people are in a more vulnerable state until we start seeing frequent patching of OSs.
And Stephen, what do you think? Do you think users should be entrusted to update their devices, or do you think the updates should be pushed on them a little more assertively?
We've had 20 or 30 years of experience of forcing the users to do their own updates, and it's gone miserably badly. So I think the trend should be to do this auto updating, but do it in such a way that it doesn't interrupt the settings and the configuration and the information that's there. I know from personal experience, every time a new Android version comes out, it pretty much wipes out the phone, and you got to reset all your configuration and your screens, and so it needs to be a little cleaner, but that's definitely the way we need to go.
How does the company reconcile all these different, operating systems and things that they have to deal with?
Well, I think that's the fundamental problem we have with the technology now, in that there's a lot of security technology for mobility out there, but it's very disjointed, it's very platform dependent. We've got encryption, we've got authentication and access control and VDI and all these pieces, but as the information moves from device to device, the capabilities of the security doesn't necessarily move with it. So I think that's really the growth area, is how do we mature this market so that the security is more uniform and more widely available across different platforms, and where the data is moving, not just necessarily within the environment itself.
There are also opportunities for new technologies as well. For example, there's a small company called Mykonos that does sort of attack software against malware. Our friends at SecureWorks, owned by Dell, also do research against viruses. For example, with the H-Strand virus, they'll disconnect the H-Strand virus from the command control environment and use that to track where the command control systems are. So there are those kinds of much more proactive investigation of malware that are beginning to show up, very different from traditional signature-based approaches, but which I think have a lot of promise.
Well, and that brings up an interesting debate in the malware community: is when is a takedown by security researchers or by product vendors authorized?
Yes.
And when those are on personal computers, it's a very potentially invasive thing, but on a personal mobile device, you have a whole other set of concerns.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
What are the kinds of vulnerabilities, and how are enterprise doing to kind of overcome those situations?
Well,
from your point of view.
Well, frankly, on the mobile space, we haven't really seen a lot of these vulnerabilities being taken advantage of. We've seen a few, and largely the vulnerabilities being taken advantage of are the ones used to jailbreak or root phones. Those are being repurposed into malware, and we aren't seeing the origination of vulnerabilities and exploits by the malware authors.
There's a reason for that, and that's that malware authors are not dummies, and they realize that the PC-connected, broadband infrastructure, wired broadband, is such easy pickings that, if you're going to code a botnet, or if you're going to go do something that has some, financial or identity theft type purpose, you'd be crazy not to do it for PCs on broadband. So once that becomes no longer the correct answer to that equation, then we'll see the attacks shift.
So then is a platform like Android with so many different variations and architectures, is that more safe at the end of the day than something that's more like iOS, where everything's kind of the same?
It's a double-edged sword. Like in the business community, the software architecture on our desktops is dominated by one company. And you could say that from the perspective of an attacker, that's a good thing, because the last time I checked, a diverse, ecosystem in a forest or a rainforest with lots of different species and plants and things is not going to be knocked out by one disease, whereas a monoculture could easily be knocked out. So you could take that perspective, but from the perspective of the IT team, the IT security team, it's quite a mess, because then you have a configuration management nightmare. You may not have security controls that are applied uniformly. So there's two kind of sides to that coin. Count me in as preferring the diverse ecosystem.
Well, the diversity argument actually is very unique with IT, because unlike in nature, all the diverse devices in an IT environment may have access to the same data. So it's multiple paths, not independent.
Could be. Yeah, fair point.
Bob, you look like you had a point to make.
Just, I think it's also very important to pay attention to the social engineering aspect of attacks. That although we're focused on technology, in our case, for example, at RSA, the initial vector of attack on us was a social engineering attack, a phishing attack through email, which led to the introduction of malware. In fact, 2 generations of malware. But it's very dangerous, I think, in this environment to neglect that social engineering piece, because that's hugely important as a vector.
So that brings it back to the employee or the user at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
So what are companies doing to kind of educate their users about issues like phishing scams and that potential malware?
Well, certainly most organizations have some kind of security training. We do at EMC. In fact, I wrote it for EMC. And it's something we're required to take, but it's extremely difficult. In our case, for example, there were 20 employees who were targeted in this attack, and 1 clicked on that.
It only takes
on
one,
that
right?
And it only took 1 out of those 20, out of our 50,000 employees. So it's very difficult. It's very difficult.
All right, well, when we come back, the audience will get its chance to weigh in, and we'll get final thoughts from our panelists. So stay with us. On using personal devices in the workplace. So let's see what the audience has to say. If you have a question, raise your hand and we'll send a mic your way. I made a rhyme on accident. That was awesome. We've got one in the back here, I think.
So just a quick question. I know we talked a little bit about sandboxing. I work at a very large enterprise, one of the biggest companies in the world actually. We've been using products such as Good for Enterprise across iPads, Android tablets, phones. It seems to be working perfectly fine. It's not the most convenient for users, but it seems pretty secure. What are the problems with that, using that today? I mean, I know it'll improve, but for today, that seems like a perfectly viable solution for enterprises. So what are the problems?
You're talking about Good for Enterprise?
Yes.
So we actually were discussing that a little bit before this panel. So how is software like that benefited in keeping enterprise secure from the user?
Well, I think it's a great solution, and sandboxing in general works really well. Security is always a compromise, right, between keeping your data safe and actually letting people do their work. And so being able to keep the sensitive stuff in that sandbox and have reasonable restrictions around moving things in and out is a pretty good compromise. It does have some shortcomings in terms of the tools available within the sandbox. Most of the really productive tools are outside the sandbox, and so you get that problem of moving data in and out. But I think as a first generation, it's doing pretty well in terms of at least introducing these things in the workplace and getting us used to different ways that we can use them.
Bob, what do you think are some of the downsides?
So certainly the main disadvantage is exactly what Steve just said. That is, it tends to restrict you in one environment or the other. I think there are also still risks for the enterprise in that regard. It is still possible to have infections that cross between the environments. And one of the things that we've looked at are ways to have trusted roots of trust that are hardware-based. So, for example, using the Westmere chip from Intel on the PC, being able to track what actually is happening when you load a virtual image, for example. So I think there are still some security issues that have to be addressed as well.
I think it's still the preseason. I don't think the game started yet. So running good is fine. Running any of these types of tools is fine. But I'll bet the people sitting around you over here who aren't running that have had just about as many problems or non-problems as you've had, and that's because I don't think the game started yet. So the concern I have is simply that historically, when you try to build a sandbox environment on top of an OS vulnerabilities like buffer overflows and other types of things can be used to circumvent these types of controls. Not always, but most of the time. I was building change root jails 20 years ago, on Unix, and they never seemed to work. So
I have to agree with Ed here. Basically, I think especially with a personal device where you're going to arbitrary websites, downloading other apps, the question comes down to the platform and the sandbox. Any of those malicious apps, how hard is it for them to break out of that sandbox and get full access to the device? And if they have full access there, they can likely get access to enterprise data.
That's a jailbreaking. When was the last time a jailbreak was not possible for for any of the popular devices that we're all using?
Usually
been
less
pretty
than a week,
consistent.
yeah.
It's about a week. So I'm not saying this is not the right kind of thing. I'm actually a very big proponent of R&D in this area. I fund a lot of that work in my own organization. I think it's the right model. But I'm just saying, historically, it's been tough to get it right. And the only way I know to get it right, the only way I know to write secure code is to write less of it. And the only way I know to build a secure device or function or anything is to have it do less and have less functionality, less features, less code, less. You start minimizing. And then before you know it, you actually have a prayer of getting your arms around some degree of correctness. It makes it hard for people to hack.
And I'll add something to Ed's thing. The only way to know how secure something is to try and break it.
That's absolutely true.
I'd also add to that as well, one reason why Flash and Adobe PDFs, for example, are so vulnerable is they are so complex and bind together data and instructions in ways that make it very hard to be sure that you've closed all the loopholes. So another case in point.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's take our next question. Got a lot out here today. Great.
Now that users are purchasing their own devices and corporations no longer have the power to incentivize hardware manufacturers with their wallet, what can corporations do to make sure that handset manufacturers that lock down the boot ROM and don't allow the users to actually update their devices? How can we incentivize and actually get them to move in that direction since we no longer give them money directly?
Did you guys hear that question? Okay.
Yeah. So I think ultimately incentives drive behavior, and so what you'll see in this model is less of a situation where a corporation has a collective bargaining position with their suppliers, and you'll see individuals voting with their wallets, right? So if a device or an OS is perceived to be somehow less secure than other devices or OSs, there'll be less of those bought. And so what you'll see is more of a democratization of device selection driving the behavior of these OEMs. Economically, they're incented to do one thing, to sell more devices. If improved security sells more devices, they'll fix that problem. Today, it's not really an immediate problem for them, but it will become one.
We're definitely seeing a focus in that kind of area, a shift rather in that focus, because originally we had companies like Dell who were providing most of the hardware and then Windows being the software on those machines for large corporations. And now, as you said, we're seeing employees voting with their wallets and using companies that traditionally weren't in that kind of enterprise situation. Right. So now you have to then support these new tools and these new PCs and handhelds that people want to use instead. So that opens up a whole new can of worms that people have to deal with.
That's right.
All right, any other points?
In addition to incentivizing the employee, the other thing we do at EMC is a lot of collaboration with providers, so AT&T in particular, in fact. So there are consortia that are being formed at the enterprise level to try to deal with these problems and help create more secure devices from the get-go.
Okay, great. Next question. How convenient.
All right, next door. So given the current environment of how open platforms work, and a lot of the open platforms are fairly regulated by the OEMs who control them, enterprises can't really rely, I don't think, on patches coming from the OSs directly rather than from the OEMs themselves. So is there some way that that policy can be changed per corporation, per enterprise, in order to find vulnerabilities that they're aware of and maybe push some sort of app or fix that, or some sort of wall around known vulnerabilities so that they're proactively protecting data rather than waiting for patches to come along from the OEM?
Are you asking if the enterprise is responsible?
Yeah, is there
for
something?
pushing the
Well, not if they're
updates?
responsible, but are they capable of putting up walls around vulnerabilities they're aware of rather than waiting for OEMs or OSs to provide patches that do the same thing?
Go ahead, Charles.
If you're speaking to the open source model, specifically the Android operating system, do they have that ability? Yes. Are they likely to exercise that ability? No. In the same way that we saw with Linux on servers, right? Sure, you can patch it and customize it all you want. Most people don't, right? They rely on the vendor to provide that value add to them.
But the suggestion that the OEM controls the distribution is almost right. Like the OEM can't go in and convince Google, for example, to do XYZ. But what they can do is in their distribution of Android, they can do something that may be non-standard. We see that now, right? In Android, there's this decision that root is locked down, which from a security perspective, you'd go, yeah, that actually sounds like the right thing. But from the perspective of a developer trying to build antivirus or SSL VPN, it's a mess because in order to build that, you need root access. So what happens is OEMs essentially jailbreak the OS, and and you get all these non-standard kind of root commands that are in OEM distributions of Android. And so I'm not saying it's good or bad or anything. I'm just saying right now we're in the early stages of this ecosystem trying to figure itself out. And the OEM plays a large role in this, there's no question. And we have one model, like with Apple, where it's a very, very tightly bound model between hardware and software. Android's a little different. The enterprise, to be honest with you, in 2011 is sitting on the sidelines trying to figure out what to do and figure out what's going on, and certainly getting the requirements to these folks. But it's really the preseason right now. This game hasn't started yet, and when it does, I hope we're ready.
And the question actually brought up a good point about the proactive fixing of vulnerabilities. One thing we've seen in software is that it's really hard for defenders to find every vulnerability when attackers typically need just one. Yeah. And one of the unique opportunities of the mobile ecosystem right now is you have three dominant platforms, Apple, Google, and BlackBerry, that use a mobile web browser with the same core. And that may be vulnerable to the same vulnerabilities. However, a lot of the platform security differs and has different implementations in each of them. And at the end of the day, an attacker needs to be able to exploit these vulnerabilities. And the defenses of the platform itself also provide a barrier there. And so we get to see which ones work better than others.
That's right. What's been your experience, Stephen?
It's difficult enough. Organizations really have a hard time now, just getting uniform patches on regular old desktop computers. I think to put them in the position of understanding, vulnerabilities and fixes within the mobile operating systems as they're rapidly updating is probably beyond their capability. Not that they're not smart enough, but it takes time to research and then find these vulnerabilities, figure out how they work, and then pass them individually. I think, as Ed pointed out, that this is still a very immature space, and right now we need to rely on the operating system vendors and the application vendors, to be pushing out the patches until we can figure out a better way to do this more uniformly.
Okay, great. Do we have another question?
My question is on security versus searches by law enforcement. There's been news recently where it's where police consider the cell phone as a clear view. It's in clear view, so they have the authority to search it without a warrant. And so I was wondering your opinions on this. And I was also wondering where if a cell phone goes into evidence and the company decides they don't want their information in a court of law and they just decide to remote wipe it. And what's your opinions and criticisms on that?
Okay, well, a lot of that's kind of outside the realm of this discussion, but I think what's interesting is the idea of if there were some kind of corporate situation going on with the law, would it be within their right to then go and remotely wipe that device, or would that be seen as destruction of evidence?
I don't think any of us are lawyers here, so obviously we want to seek legal counsel. Exactly. But it's pretty clear that once any object is tagged as evidence in a legal proceeding, a company going in and wiping that would be very bad.
Probably bad, yeah.
And they would not want to do that. So from that standpoint, I think it's pretty clear. The rest of it, it depends on the specifics of the case, the jurisdiction, and all that.
We're not qualified to give legal advice in this scenario.
So I want to caution you against wiping evidence. That's bad.
I'll give you the name of a good lawyer after the show.
Let's take another question.
Actually, it does lead to a very interesting point around the responsibility of the enterprise for its data. And that, in fact, one of the most important things we haven't really touched on are ways the enterprise looks to control the movement of that information, both in terms of things like data loss prevention, but also in terms of encryption. We touched on that quickly. And I think that actually is a very critical part of the answer there, that the enterprise really should think about where its data is going and how much it allows that to move out to the mobile device as part of its risk posture, as part of its policies.
It's very interesting. Do we have got one more question. Great. Oh, sorry, over there. You already had the mic. Go ahead.
I think that you guys are implementing great solutions, security solutions to protect your enterprise, but I haven't heard anything about finding or searching for people who are potential security breachers, how they can prevent them from joining those evildoer communities.
So are you talking about like finding potential leak situations within?
Actual individuals who are, I guess, other countries or globally, who are
like looking for hackers?
Who can actually join hacking communities.
Hunting them down and smiting them.
Before they can even do the evil deeds. Is there anything being done in regards to that?
There are actually a number of areas where that's not, at RSA, for example, we have a group that actively does that poses as fraudsters and goes into both the fraudster forums and the malware forums in order to find out what's being sold in malware, what credentials are being sold, and then use that to trace back, both to identify the vectors and also to find the perpetrators. That's also true of SecureWorks, for example. So there are a number of non-governmental agencies that do that, typically on behalf of enterprises rather than individuals. But it's very much a part of the security model in the industry as a whole.
Is there a situation where they do work with governmental agencies as well?
Yes, very much so. In fact, when we were breached in March, we had extremely close relationships with the federal government to find out what had happened and then where that came from.
Interesting. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah. Oh, over here. Hi.
We're talking about securing enterprises, right? I'm concerned, though, if we're voting with our wallet, what is the government, secure the defense industry voting with their wallet when it regards to secure applications? I read in Wall Street Journal a couple of months ago that they're allowing iPads and right on the battlefield and all laptops and all these things. So I get, maybe it's outside of this discussion, let me know if it is, but what is the government betting behind when it comes to secure mobile apps? What are they doing? Do we know?
So this is funny. It's almost like the ultimate end to our earlier discussion. For example, Obama wanted to use his personal BlackBerry, and of course they had very stringent rules and regulations about how someone of his position can use a personal device. So what does the government do in that scenario?
So there is a major initiative, and there have been, of course, the cybersecurity initiatives in the government for the last 5 years. There's a major new initiative in the government that involves a lot of folks in the industry as well, especially with regard to advanced persistent threats and the ways in which those are being waged and the vectors that are being used. So there's a great deal of effort, I know, including folks from RSA who are involved in that. I don't know that there's been much public, quite honestly, in terms of those strategies yet. I don't know whether you've heard things, Stephen, from the financial industry in that regard.
In the financial services space, we dabble in government work, but our primary concern is obviously keeping people's money safe. So while it's interesting from a what's come out of it standpoint, we're not that actively involved in the government side of the security.
In addition to sort of government policy, the mobile operators themselves are taking it on themselves to help solve these problems. And the way that mobile operators solve a lot of these problems is through standards. So there's a lot of participation in standards bodies. They're looking at solving these problems. Those standards then get pushed out to the device manufacturers, the OEMs, the OS manufacturers, so that we have a single systematic solution to the problem across the diversity of devices. Again, still early in terms of these standards around mobile device security, but work is in progress.
Great. Next question. Hi.
This is actually related to the previous discussion just now. In the financial services forum, the financial services industry, privacy is kind of a huge concern as far as work email for SEC and FINRA, like for people that do trades with hedge funds, ETFs. How do you feel that it'll affect their privacy for someone who has their work email monitored if they're using one device for the personal and corporate email?
Well, that's a real interesting point. So at People's United, what we've done is there are certain areas of the company where you cannot use a personal device. In many areas, you can't use a mobile device at all. For instance, in our security trading area. And that extends to things like social networking and different types of websites. So we have to keep a very important watch on not just what devices we're using, but also who's using them and what are the regulatory constraints around that. So for the general banking public, the employee public, general, Android, iOS, the regular devices, BlackBerries are just fine. But if you're in certain areas, if you're trading securities, if you're dealing with insurance, different parts, then there are much more tight restrictions on what you can do. And I think that's pretty much mirrored throughout the industry.
Well, I was wondering, how widespread is that across different industries? Is that something that goes beyond just the financial sector?
Not just across industries. I recently moved to Europe. I live in Switzerland now, and the regulations on privacy in Europe are dramatically different from here, including issues, for example, about the movement of information across national boundaries. As you might imagine, also financial issues in Switzerland are particularly of concern, and there have been very significant issues regarding what constitutes privacy of information and what doesn't. It's an area that's absolutely under discussion at the moment in Europe, and I would fully expect that some of the quite stringent requirements around privacy there are actually likely to change, in part because of mobile devices and the issues around movement of information.
I would like to just add a point about privacy, particularly in the context of the generation that a lot of people here share, kind of a younger group. Privacy has never been this monolithic, everybody agrees to one thing approach. Young people are part of a generation right now that puts everything on their Facebook page, including what they're going to be doing next week and who they're dating and what types of people they like to date and all sorts of things that you would just never in a million years imagine, sharing with the world about yourself. But at the same time would be a group that would be very concerned with potential surveillance of their telephone calls or something. And you think that's kind of inconsistent. Society as a group is going to have to determine what we would consider privacy. In the EU, for example, we see restrictions on IP address as sort of as a private thing. And anybody who does networking goes, how is that, how does that link to privacy? Exactly. This overzealous approach. And then in the U.S., we have, sort of reactionary issues, like the Patriot Act was passed right after 9/11, and changed some of the procedures. So I think what's going to happen is that technology is going to force us as a group to agree to some compromises here. Law enforcement needs certain types of access. Citizens need certain types of privacy, but also to provide cybersecurity, certain things that we have to all agree, behavioral monitoring, intrusion detection, other types of things require some degree of surveillance. So I think all of these things will eventually converge on something that we hopefully, for the most part, will agree on.
That's interesting. If
I can follow up on that, it's interesting you kind of brought up the privacy aspect, because we're seeing a shift in generational attitudes towards privacy. Privacy used to be about secrecy. Right? I didn't want anybody to know my stuff. That's right. With the generation coming up, privacy is about control. I want to be able to tell my friends every intimate detail about my life, but nobody else needs to know that. Which is interesting because in the corporate environment, that's what we're wrestling with these mobile devices, is control of our information. So I think once, as you said, there needs to be this compromise. Once each side kind of figures out what it wants to control and what it's willing to give up for that, I think we'll have a much better time with it.
Interesting. Yeah, that's something I've thought about a lot, actually, in terms of NFC and mobile devices, and how that is a technology that's really come into itself in places like Japan and other parts of Asia. But here in the States, there's been kind of a stopgap with that because people are concerned about their loss of privacy. Yet, as Ed mentioned, people are freely giving away personal information all the time, purchasing things online, talking to friends over Facebook, and so there seems to be some kind of imbalance there between what is convenient and makes our lives better versus what is actually the bad kind of privacy giving away.
Sometimes technology leads and policy follows, right? People do it because the technology's enabled them to do it, and now we have to figure out what does it mean. And in other cases, policy leads and technology follows. I think in the area of privacy and control of data, this is an area where the technology could be written very quickly, but we need to figure out first what the policy is.
Yeah. And in the end, I think it comes down to we want to control our information, like you mentioned. Users want to control what information of theirs is put online, how much of that information is shared with their employer, and employers want to control their information, how much is shared with their employees, and how much is shared with people who may not be employees of the firm. And in the end, it's all about, when we bring our personal devices into the enterprise, we are mixing contexts, and it's part of a societal shift towards a less of a blend, less of a rigid workday, where our days, our personal and work lives blend together a lot more.
I used to really tease a few of my friends who would carry both their work BlackBerry and then their personal iPhone around with them. Now I totally understand why that might make total sense. All right, well, I want to thank you all for coming in today. Thanks to our great panelists, Ed, Stephen, Robert, and Charles, and of course our wonderful audience here today, and of course our terrific hosts here at the Stevens Institute of Technology. I'm Veronica Belmont with Dino Diazovi, and we'll see you next time on another edition of the Mobile Security Show.